Good morning, everyone. Thought I'd record a video here. Maybe you wanted to see my face, um, just for a little bit at least. Um, but hopefully, everyone yesterday was able to go on and submit to the discussion board. And today, I have a brief video to follow, which is going to go through chapter one in more detail and point out some of the main ideas that I think are really important for you to know moving forward. And then for the rest of class, what I want you to do is to read chapter two. And then I'm going to have posted on Veracross a reading response, a reading journal response that I'm going to have you submit. So with the different chapters of Slaughterhouse-Five I had mentioned before, I want to look at the book really in detail. So I'm giving you plenty of time to read it and really space in and out and incorporating a lot of class time in which to read the chapters, which, most of which maybe are like 25 minutes to probably get through. But rather than doing a system like usual with the journals where it's like quarterly and then I collect them at the end, figure the way things are going, the way class is set up now, it makes a lot more sense just to have you submit them as we go along, and then I'll grade them individually rather than just collect them all at the end of the quarter and then put them in. So my preference for the journals still would be that you handwrite them and that you submit them as a PDF. If you have an issue or a problem with that, please reach out to me. Let me know, and we can talk about that at that point. But yeah, so a lot of the stuff we'll be doing for Slaughterhouse-Five will be either through the discussion boards or based on the individual chapters. As I mentioned on Veracross, there'll be at least a couple of short essays, timed essays on no red ink. But then, as I also mentioned on Veracross, there will be a more comprehensive project that will be based on the novel as well. And that won't be something that we'll really get into the details about until a little bit later in the book. So make sure you're following the reading schedule. As I mentioned before, if you have any issues, questions, concerns, please reach out to me through Microsoft Teams. We may have a quick check-in at some point for class. I'll let you know about that as well. If we do that, there'll be advance notice for that, so you can be aware, since it would be during our regular class period. But anyway, in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me at any point directly through Teams, either through chat or through the call, or email me if you have any issues, questions, problems, concerns that you need me to help you with. Okay. So let's move into the book. So a couple things here to look at with chapter one that are important. First and foremost is the idea of how this chapter is functioning in terms of the larger novel. So the first chapter is functioning as a frame for the rest of the story. So what exactly does that mean? It's that it's setting up the story that's to come, which is going to begin in chapter two. And when you get to the end of the book in chapter 10, you'll notice that it's going to return to this framing device. So just like think of a picture, the picture is what's important, and the frame is just what's going around it and setting it off. And so that's how it would function in a novel or a story as well. Is it setting the story up and marking off, delineating between what the story is exactly versus what the author or the narrator, how the author, the narrator is introducing that story. So in chapter one, we're actually getting the voice of the author as far as Vonnegut in first person. It's written using I, and beyond that, this isn't really so much a persona or a character as so much as it's Vonnegut's voice talking about his own experience in his own life. So it's this the biographical voice of Vonnegut. And a couple things here in the first part, you have in the opening paragraph that begins, all this happened more or less. The war parts anyway are pretty much true. And so very famous kind of opening here that's establishing the idea of a certain level of unreliability or a certain aspect of fiction blending with fact. And the idea that Vonnegut is really, in a certain extent, dealing with historical events, real life historical events that he experienced on a larger scale in Dresden, but then also his own biographical connection, which would be his own personal experience within the context of that larger historical events. So he's saying this is pretty much what happened, pretty much true. It gives the reader the idea that, yeah, there's a certain level of accuracy here, but there's also a certain aspect that what you're hearing is not necessarily the complete story. It's part of the story, and he is going to weave in and out of this story throughout, as far as the voice of the author, that is. And as I mentioned, he's going to set this up with the first chapter and the last chapter being his voice. In between is going to really focus on the story of Billy Pilgrim, who is his protagonist, who experiences some of the things that Vonnegut would have experienced, but is in no way necessarily a substitute or a fill-in for Vonnegut. So what you have here as well is in this first part, in the framing of the story, this link between the reality of Vonnegut's life and the historical events, when he says he really did go back to Dresden in 1967. And so this idea of going back or revisiting the past is going to be a huge part of chapter 1, but also the novel itself, which focuses a lot on time and the link between the past, the present, and the future. As the video that I had you guys watch yesterday talked about that as well. Just a quick point here too, he also, if you notice, mentions this connection of going back to the title when this is the first time that the slaughterhouse is mentioned, which was where they were kept where Vonnegut was kept as prisoner of war during the bombing of Dresden. And then, of course, that's going to really be one of the central parts of the novel as well. You have this phrase that's also going to be really important that he mentions throughout the book at the end of this paragraph, so it goes, which more often than not is something that he uses in response to death. So usually when you see that phrase used, and it is repeated quite frequently throughout the book, it's following up on someone dying, and oftentimes some horrible, violent death. And it's sort of like a oh well type of whatever expression, as he's going to explain a little bit later, the significance of that, as far as where it comes from. But just the idea that, what do you say? What can you say? That's life. This is what happens, and so he frequently likes to kind of throw that in there, just to keep making that point and bringing it in over and over again. There's a certain level here that is going to also focus on this idea of repetition, just like the way he uses the phrase "so it goes" to repeat and to make the point about how things are always the same or things don't usually change. He mentions this rhyme as well, and he says that he thinks about how useless the part of his memory, the Dresden part of his memory, had been, that it makes him think of this famous lyric, and more significantly this limerick, I should say, which is this idea that it's an endless cycle, it's endlessly repeating. When the man says, "My name is Jan Janssen," and then the end part of the limerick just loops back to the beginning part of the limerick. So making that point about repetition, which in the case of the book is closely related to both the concepts of time, but of history as well. And so the idea that people are the same, therefore historical events bear a certain level of similarity. And this idea of distinguishing the past, present, and the future becomes more and more difficult when all these events just sort of loop together or cycle together. As he says here, so on until infinity after that, at the end of that limerick. Another important point that Vonnegut makes here in chapter 1 is this idea of anti-war book. He said his friend said something about the book being an anti-war book, and the response being, well, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? And the point being that war is something that's always going to be present, always has been present, and an anti-war book, it would be foolish or naive to think that an anti-war book is going to stop that from happening. It's like trying to stop a glacier. It's basically a force of nature or a force of human nature. Vonnegut often links those two things, those two ideas in the book between nature and human nature. But that the idea that it's a force of human nature, it's something that's always been present, and so therefore whatever we have to say about it or an individual has to say about it probably isn't going to have very much of an impact on it or at stopping it at least. So the next part I want to point out to you is going to tie directly into some of the information that was contained in that video I had you watch, which talked about Vonnegut's background studying anthropology at the University of Chicago and how he studied the structure of stories. And this observation that he makes in chapter 1 is going to relate directly to that. And it's going to be really important to understand for the book when he says that what they were teaching or what he learned at that when he studied that was that there was no difference between anybody. And that would be like across history, across cultures, and that also means, or beyond that, I should say, would be that nobody is ridiculous or bad or disgusting. And when Vonnegut said his father had told him or mentioned to him that he never wrote a story with a villain in it, he said that was one of the things he learned in college after the war. And meaning that this idea or this concept that everyone's a villain, or at least everyone has the capacity to be a villain. And maybe this concept of good versus evil is artificial, an artificial construct, and not really a reflection of reality where everybody, no matter who, where, when, has the potential to be a villain or to be a hero for that matter. So it's not such a clear-cut sort of black and white approach. It's much more ambiguity in relation to that. And the book holds that up as well. He's trying to demystify or de-romanticize the war, so it's not as if the Americans are the people that embody all the great values, and the Germans are the opposite. He's just really making the observation that there's good and bad on both sides. So this point is continued when Vonnegut's talking about having a conversation with his war friend's wife, and how he can tell she's upset with him and he's not sure why. And then she tells him basically that your experience, you were basically an innocent child, a baby, and that her feeling was that basically he's going to look back on that as a man and tell a story that's going to glorify war, and that's going to be sort of used as something that could be propaganda or motivate other young people to go to war. And she's very upset by that. And then, as he says, um, she was upset because she didn't want her babies or anyone else's babies to be killed in the wars, and felt that books and movies often encourage that. And so he mocks that a couple of times throughout the book, this idea of the romanticization of war or warfare. And then so he tells her that he'll call the book The Children's Crusade. And so there's a reference to more of a detailed description of what that references, which is when children were sent to war during the Crusades, and ultimately sold into slavery. It was a little bit of a historical flashback that he provides here, but the idea is that is the subtitle of the book. So the book is officially titled Slaughterhouse-Five, but it also has the two other subtitles, which is The Children's Crusade, which is what he tells her he'll name it. And so this idea of young people, innocent people going to war, and how they're corrupted by it or used and abused during their experience, but also A Duty Dance with Death. The idea of duty, of course, representing military service. There's a number of images throughout the book that deal with dancing, referencing that, and then of course death, which is really central to the novel. So the next point, just a couple quick points here before we wrap it up. The one is this idea of the endurance of nature and also the indifference of nature, which he focuses here on the beginning. Makes this first reference. It's going to also come up at the end of the book as well, when he says basically there's never really anything to say about a massacre. Everyone's dead, and there's nothing really to say, and the only noise that you hear afterwards are the birds. And what do they say? And they basically sing a bird song. And there's this idea that what they say, their response, is just as meaningful and valuable as anyone just as meaningful and just as valuable as what anyone else could say, any human could say, because there's nothing to be said, nothing at least that would explain it or justify it or make it better. And then getting back to that point, he says that that's what he told his sons, is that he didn't want them to be involved in anything like that, or to get satisfaction from death of your enemies, and that is just carrying directly over from what he had spoken to Bernard's wife about. And just this last point, at the very end of chapter 1, Vonnegut starts talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible, and stories of destruction and massacre in the Bible. And the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, he says basically people felt, the people were evil, so it was better off that they were destroyed. And then he focuses on this character of Lot's wife, and the solution to her is that she was told not to look back, but she did. And as he says, I love her for that because it was so human. And then, of course, she was turned into a pillar of salt, and that was her punishment for looking back. So it brings up this idea of the danger of looking back, which is essentially what Vonnegut is doing in this book. Book was written in 1969. He's basically looking back from a period of 25 years and trying to get perspective on this series of events, and not to really tell a realistic story, but yet to tell a story that's based on things that he experienced directly, at the same time making some larger points about humanity and war. But the idea of the danger of looking back, and that it's also a part of human nature, always trying to get perspective on things, and not that it's going to, again, this is usually where his sort of thoughts sort of run, not that it's going to bring any sort of closure or satisfaction, but it's just a human need to look back and maybe rationalize or try to come to some level of find some comfort or solace or understanding by looking back. but not to really expect too much because it's often an empty exercise, but it's still, there's a human impulse and need to do that, to look back. And then to complete the frame here, well, I'm sorry, one more thing. He does say he's not going to look back anymore, but it's a failure because it was written by a pillar of salt. So again, the idea of the flaws of humans prevent them from ever really being able to find what they're looking for when it comes to answers about so many things that are ultimately unanswerable. But he completes the frame by saying here's going to be the beginning of the story, and it begins with, listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time, and that's the beginning of chapter 2. And then he says, and it's going to end like this, Potoit, which is the end of chapter 10. And that is the reference to the birds that he just mentioned earlier in chapter 1 about at the end of a massacre. That's all that you hear. That's all that's left to be said. So he's really setting this frame up from the first sentence of the actual story as it begins in chapter 2 to the very end of the book, while not revealing or spoiling what's going to happen. Just giving you the idea of here's how it's going to begin and here's how it's going to end. And if you think about the video and what the video talked about as far as Vonnegut's structure of stories, about how it goes from beginning to end, and there's good fortune and there's bad fortune, and there's a wave that's created, and he felt that the closest that to real life is a story that's going to go up and down constantly, and not just have like a big arc, or you think of like those pyramids or triangles that we talk about with like conflicts, but that rather stories are like life, a matter of routine, and sometimes there's good fortune, and sometimes there's bad fortune, and it's not no high highs or low lows. It's just sort of ups and downs repeated all the way to the end, however that end comes. And at the end, what's left is this sort of voice of nature, which is in some way the idea that it's enduring, but also in some sense there's an indifference there. It's not really offering any sort of comfort or any sort of explanation or any sort of idea that there's some grand plan for our lives. It's just a sequence of events, basically. That's what Vonnegut's talking about here. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful in giving you some ideas about the book in chapter 1. And like I said, I want you to go ahead and finish chapter 2. And then for next week, we're going to be going to, you want to be finishing chapters 3 and 4. Okay, great. I'll talk to you guys later. Take care. Bye.